Hey class, happy Monday. I'm streaming live from Clovis, California. Okay, it is a beautiful day. It's a beautiful Monday of our coronavirus journey. Okay, and this week of that journey, we are looking at mechanisms of evolution in chapter 15.2 of your textbook. So we are coming from a week where we looked at evidence for evolution. So how did embryos and DNA and cells and fossils and comparing anatomy of organisms, how does that give us evidence that evolution's happening? How does that give us evidence that we came from a common ancestor? We explored natural selection, and now we're going to see how evolution, how does it actually happen? How do you get change in a population? Okay, and our objective for that is this question. Okay, I want you to be able to answer this question. How do changes in allele frequency happen? And how do those changes cause evolution in a population? And in today's video, we're going to focus a lot on this allele frequency idea. Okay, what does that mean and how does it work in evolution? Okay, we need to review genetics first. So if you remember from January and February, okay, DNA contains information to make a protein, what we've been calling a gene. Okay, those genes control physical features. So the genotype leading to the phenotype. I have a piece of DNA that controls the pigment of my skin. I have a piece of DNA that makes a gene that makes my eyes a certain color. And with that, those genes, they have different versions. We call those alleles. So with eye color, whoosh, I have a gene, an allele, that gives me a blue color. But some of you can have an allele that gives a brown color or a green color or hazel. Okay? Different gene versions we call alleles. Now, those alleles, they give us variation in our population. So with our eye color, we have different eye colors because we have different versions of a gene. And we have been representing those with different letters, so capital B and lowercase b. We've also done B primes or B pluses, just a different symbol to represent a different version. And like with eye color, the alleles give you differences with the same type of trait. With Darwin's finches, there were different alleles for different beak sizes. Now, if this was a population of finches that Darwin found on an island, each of these different beak sizes are being controlled by the same gene. Okay, it's making a protein that is building this finch beak. But each of these finches are being born with a different allele, a different version. And you can have one allele, you can have 100 alleles of the same gene. Now, in natural selection, okay, natural selection, it acts on a population's physical traits, but it's actually changing the alleles and the percentage of alleles in a population. So to quickly review, so natural selection is when the environment causes the population to change over time. So there is some sort of gene that has variation. So with beetles, there's a gene that controls the pigment on its shell. And one version, one allele, is better suited for that environment than the other. So this orange allele helps the beetles that happen to have it survive and reproduce. Whereas the ones that are green, well, they're out of luck. The crow's going to eat them. They're not going to make as many babies. So in the next generation, you have more orange, and that pattern continues. More crows are eating more green ones, so green ones are surviving and reproducing less, whereas the orange ones with an orange allele for shell color survive and reproduce until you have a population that's mostly orange or maybe all orange. Okay, now when we look at not the physical trait, but the genetics, the changing genetics, we're going to look at the allele frequency. So allele frequency is the ratio of one type of allele to all alleles of a gene in a population. So let's look at some snapdragon flowers. Okay, real common example in genetics because the flower color is controlled by one gene with two alleles. Okay, a nice simple model in biology. Now, in our population of snapdragons, we need to count up the alleles. We have 8 flowers, but they're diploid. They have 2 copies of an allele. So they have 16 total alleles. 8 times 2 is 16. Now let's look at one allele to find the allele frequency for capital R. So if I count up all these alleles, I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. 12 total capital R alleles. I do the math. 12 divided by 16, I get a ratio of 0.75. I get an allele frequency for capital R as 75%. Okay. So when examining that, we also have to think about the gene pool. So the total number of alleles for my population, I call that a gene pool. And I'm just looking at one trait, one gene. So in this case, I'm looking at flower color. So I have 16 alleles for flower color in this snapdragon population, or this snapdragon gene pool. And in that gene pool, I have 12 total capital R alleles and 4 total R prime alleles. Now, when I look at these two generations, now at first glance they look different. So in my first generation, I've got red and pink. I've got half and half, 50%, 50%. But in the second generation, that's not true. I now have 5 red flowers, 2 pink flowers, and a white flower. Okay, and you can see my phenotype frequency is changed. But if I look at the allele frequency, the percentage of each allele I have, it's not different. It's the same. Okay, and in this case, it happens because flower color is controlled by incomplete dominance. So if you're heterozygous, you get a mix, a middle mixed trait of the homozygous dominant and the homozygous recessive. Okay, and so when breeding happened and a new generation was made, the alleles got mixed up, but the frequency stayed the exact same. Okay, and so when that happens, you go generation to generation with no change in allele frequency. Okay, that's called genetic equilibrium. Okay, this is a population that is genetically not changing. Okay, and this frequency, the phenotype frequency can change as long as the allele frequency is unchanged. So genetic equilibrium isn't looking at the phenotype, it's looking just at the alleles, the percentage of alleles. All right, and in this case, this is not evolution. When a population is not changing its allele frequency, it's in genetic equilibrium, there's no evolution. Even though the traits, the phenotypes might be changing, if the allele frequency is the exact same from one generation to the next, there is no evolution happening. But let's look at a case where genetic equilibrium, it changes. The allele frequency changes, and how that looks in a population. Okay, so let's look at a population of mice. Okay, and they have a gene for fur color, and one allele gives it a brown, and one allele gives it a black. Okay, and in their environment, the selecting pressure is this ferocious canine predator that's going to run around and try to eat mice. And so whatever mouse has the more beneficial allele to help it survive and reproduce is going to be more common in the population. The allele frequency will change to be more like one allele over another. So let's look at the data. So when I look at the data, the change in allele frequency, in the first generation I was about 50-50. Okay, 50% of this lowercase a allele. So half of the mice were homozygous recessive and half were homozygous dominant. But that ferocious canine predator ate more of these dark mice. Okay, maybe they were more easily spotted in the environment where this is happening. So in this gene pool, in the next generation, it changes, and you have a whole lot more of the capital A allele. It was 50-50, but now it's 70%, and you only have 30% of the recessive allele, the lowercase a allele that makes this dark fur color. Okay, now something else you notice that 2 of these guys are heterozygous. So this lowercase a allele can either be in heterozygous mice or homozygous recessive mice. And a 3rd generation happens, and you now have 90% capital A alleles and just 10% of this lowercase a allele. Okay, the mice that had that dark fur color, they got caught, they were eaten, and they didn't make any babies. Whereas the lighter colored mice, they survived more often, had babies, and so the 3rd generation, due to natural selection, due to the environment, this predator, eating mice that are less adapted to the specific environment, caused the allele frequency to change over 3 generations. And you go from a gene pool that was 50-50, it shifted now to a population that's 90% one allele, 10% the other allele. And as scientists, we consider this to be microevolution. When you have a change in the allele frequency over generations, it's not in genetic equilibrium anymore. Okay, that is microevolution. So natural selection is one way that can happen. You can have some sort of environmental pressure selecting for one trait, so in this case the capital A allele, to be passed down more often until you get microevolution, a change in the allele frequency. So in conclusion, microevolution happens when the gene pool is not in genetic equilibrium. Okay, and there's some sort of selective force that has to be there for the allele frequency to change in a gene pool. Okay, and also we can consider microevolution to be changes in the allele frequency of a gene pool. Okay, keep doing your work. Hope this helps with understanding allele frequency and genetic equilibrium. Okay, stay tuned for videos that will help explain other portions of chapter 15.2. All right, bye class.